Hello, fellow Bible adventurers, and welcome to our Deuteronomy chapter 28 study today. Free PDF on our website. There's a link down in the description. There are 68 verses in this chapter, so hopefully you read it before you're doing this outline, because this is definitely going to be a summary. Hopefully you do that with every chapter so that you get the details in, that you know I'm not just making stuff up and putting it down on these outlines. So let's talk about our questions as we get started. First of all, when did these events happen in history? As we've mentioned, 1450 BC, roughly 1450 years before Jesus was born. We're talking about the Israelite nation. They're the first group of people in our character section. They're known as the Hebrews. God had selected them to be his special people and to give them a special homeland. And he had made promises to give them that homeland hundreds of years before to their forefathers like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses is our second main character. He is the leader of the Israelites, helping them on their journey and delivering God's laws to them so that they know what God expects from them. Where did these events happen? We will consult our map. We have a couple places to mention here. First is Moab. That's where Moses is speaking the words of the book of Deuteronomy to the Israelites. And in this chapter and in the last chapter, we specifically are highlighting Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. They were mountains that the Israelites were going to visit when they went into the land of Canaan, and a series of blessings and cursings was to be read from the top of Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. Hop over to page number 2 to our outline section. If you remember last chapter, chapter 27, we began the series of curses that were read. Now we're going to talk about some blessings in the first section of this chapter. So the first 14 verses, the blessings that would come with obedience to God's law. So if the Israelites respected God's law, he promised to elevate them above all of the surrounding nations. He promised that he would bless their cities, their fields, their fertility, their livestock, and that he would give them victory against their enemies and a treasury full of gold. That's the first section. Now our second section, you might notice, is a lot longer. It's verses 15 through the end of the chapter, and God spends a little bit more time here talking about the curses rather than the blessing. So this is the second part of this chapter is the curses for disobedience. If Israel failed to respect God's laws, God was going to curse their cities, their fields, their fertility, and their livestock. He told them that he was going to introduce confusion and frustration into every project that they undertook. Disease would be allowed to run rampant through their land, and Israel's enemies would defeat them in battle. And they would be constantly oppressed by their enemies, and foreign kings would rule over them. If Israel refused to serve the good God who led them out of Egypt, then God would force them to serve wicked men. Their children were going to be taken from them and taken captive by their conquerors. And rather than being known as the people that God had honored with all of these special privileges in relationship with him, the Israelites would be shamed, and they would become, quote, a horror, a proverb, and a byword among the nations. These last couple curses become a little bit graphic. If Israel got wicked enough, God was going to send armies to besiege their cities. And the sieges would get so bad that the Israelites inside, they would be starving. They would abandon civility, and he says that they would resort to cannibalism. You might say, well, why does it need to be so specific like that? And part of the reason is because, spoiler alert, later on in the Old Testament, this exact thing comes to pass. And so in a sense, this is a kind of a prophecy of what the people would become. So anyway, that's for another time. Continued rebellion against God would result in, quote, extraordinary afflictions severe and lasting, and sicknesses grievous and lasting, according to verse 59. And if the people persisted and persisted and persisted in evil, then God said that he was going to take the promised land away from them and scatter them throughout the nations. Let's finish up now with our daily application. Be careful before you try to apply promises given to other people to yourself. Okay? So The reason I mention that is because some preachers will try to read verses like the verses about blessing, verses 1 through 14, and then to tell their audiences that, look, God is making you a promise that He will make you rich and prosperous if you respect and follow His laws and His commands. But the problem with that is that those verses and those promises weren't meant for the modern disciples of Jesus. They were exclusively given to the Israelite nation during a unique period in history. So the reward of following Jesus is fellowship with God and eventually heaven, but we aren't guaranteed earthly prosperity. It would be one thing if Jesus repeated promises like this to His followers in the New Testament, but we don't see promises of prestige and riches being promised by Jesus to the individuals who were giving their life to Him. This is just another example of why it's important to read in context. Don't just go around picking verses out of the Bible and saying, this applies to me, this applies to me, this applies to you, right? That's why I've said a bajillion times on this channel, you have to read in context so you know to whom these things are written.